I'd like to express my appreciation and thanks to the Chabura and to everyone involved with it. And once again, not only my appreciation, but my awe in what you've accomplished and what you continue to accomplish. This is very impressive and a very welcome addition to Jewish communities across the world. I also want to thank you, the Chabura, for launching my YouTube career. The share that I gave last week was put online, and I think it has at least 10 or 12 views or something. So I suppose this is what celebrity and superstardom must feel like. It's a heady feeling indeed. And so thank you for that. So as Ben said, this week we're going to dive deeper into Shadal and consider him as a biblical commentator and as a biblical scholar as well, and in dialogue with much of the other biblical scholarship going on in the 19th century. Before I start, again, one or two warnings first. As last week, I'm going to be speaking fairly quickly, moving fairly quickly. Encourage those to take either mental or physical notes, and I look forward to the discussion after the lecture part of today. I would also like to give a little bit of a warning in the sense that we are going to be discussing some things which are, as part of the context, we're going to be discussing ideas of biblical critics and historical source critics in the 19th century as a background to what Shadal was doing and what he was trying to do in his Pirush. And therefore, those who don't like this, or those who feel somewhat this is not for them or somewhat threatening, more than welcome to either just leave or mute me or whatever it is, and we'll say no more about it. But for the time being, we are going to jump in. So I'm going to share my screen. Hold on, share screen, and okay, yes. Can everyone see the screen as is? Yes. Okay. Fantastic. So today we're going to do the second part of this series on Shmuel David Luzzatto as a biblical scholar and commentator. Before we do, we're going to do a very brief recap of what we said last week for those who either weren't there or don't remember. So as we said about Shadal, lived from 1800 to 1865. He was a rabbi and a Jewish scholar teaching in the Rabbinical College of Padua, as we said, a very small and not particularly successful college in Italy. He lived a fairly tragic life. There was a lot of poverty and bereavement in his life. As we say, he lost his young wife, he buried 4 children, and lived his entire life, very much not in any kind of position of wealth or power, but nonetheless managed to produce enormous amounts of scholarship, dozens of books, hundreds of essays, thousands of letters, one of the great contributors to the scholarship of the movement of Jewish academic scholarship known as the Wissenschaft Judentum's movement in Central Europe in the mid to late 19th century. What is important, although we mentioned last week, of course, is that Shadal, while being very much a part of this movement, was a critic of some elements within this movement, especially those elements who are, in his eyes, too academic, too removed from the religious side of Jewish scholarship. And that was something that was very characteristic of Shadal, a by nature very conservative and sort of religiously traditional personality. Although, as we'll see today, this picture gets very complicated when we see his biblical scholarship. He had an antipathy, importantly, to both rational and mystical forms of Judaism, in the sense that he rejected the major ideas of the medieval rationalistic scholars, specifically Maimonides and his school, but also equally rejected, and I think even more strongly rejected, Kabbalah and forms of Jewish mysticism that had gained credence and sort of canonical importance in the centuries between the 13th or between the 12th and the 19th century. And Shadal rejected both and charted a sort of middle way shared in the medieval times from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and in his own time with Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and others. The main features of his religious philosophy, as we said, was a focus on ethical living, not intellectual achievements. And of course, that is at odds very firmly with the Maimonidean view of Judaism. He believed that it must be a path to practical ethical living. What the Torah teaches is something to be put immediately into practice. And that's the goal of the Torah, to have people live with each other in peace and love and harmony and compassion. And that's the number one goal. And finally, the Torah's message is exoteric. And that's going to be very important for today, that what is written in the text of the Chumash and of the Tanakh is most profitably read at a surface level. That what we see is what we ought to be seeing and what we need to assimilate into our lives, as opposed to, let's say, the opinion of the mystics, who say that actually no, what we see is simply the garb, is simply something which is hiding the real mystical truths. Shadal did not buy into this at all, and this is important to note. A biblical commentator. So Shadal wrote many commentaries and translations in his lifetime. Yeshaya, Yirmiyah, Yechezkel, Mishlei, Eov. These are very important, but also tough books of the Bible. They're often very lengthy. Linguistically, they're difficult. Also ideologically, in terms of the ideas and the paradigms that they they propound, they are also something which they are works which require a lot of grappling with, and Shadal really produced the sorts of commentaries which in a very impressive and sophisticated way try to deal with these issues. And I would say that actually his dealing with, or his involvement with translation and commentary on the Hebrew Bible was central to his efforts overall. So Shadal was a biblical scholar, not only in terms of the commentaries he actually wrote, but also in the essays that he had, that he wrote, in the letters that he wrote. Biblical commentary was also on his mind. Throughout whatever else he was writing on, the Hebrew Bible remained front and center. And also, I would say, as someone who's translating some of Shadal's works, that even his polemical works, his Hebraic works, are really just his style of writing is very biblical, or I would say pseudo-biblical, attempting to be biblical in the sense that a lot of his Hebrew sentences are simply sewing together of pre-existing words and phrases from the Tanakh, which is not only a stylistic thing, but also ideologically. Really, the Tanakh informed how he thought, how he wrote, how he expressed himself. His Jewish philosophy very much came forth in that. He wrote in 1847 a basic commentary to the Torah titled Hamishtadel. For those who are sort of linguistically inclined, this is obviously the reflexive form of Shadal, Shmuel, David, Lutzato, of his own acronyms. He referred to himself often in the third person as Shadal, and Hamishtadel is, of course, the reflexive, this meaning to strive. So this was a commentary which sought to strive or to attempt to grapple with the themes and the difficulties within the Chumash. After his death, his students produced a work called the Purusha Torah, which is a great expansion of Hamishtadel, and it includes his lecture notes, it includes various parts of his essays, comments, letters that he wrote to people. All this was compiled by his son and by several of his students from the Purusha Rabbinical College and put together as Purusha Torah. It's a little bit of a shame, in truth, that this is the case, because of course Shadal's Purusha Torah, whenever one reads it, one is at least a little bit suspicious, or has in the back of one's mind the notion that Shadal himself didn't sit down to pen this commentary from beginning to end. Rather, it was compiled after death, but nonetheless, it is still very readable. It's quite an extraordinary commentary for a few reasons. First, it frequently quotes students and interlocutors of Shadal. Shadal was very generous in terms of quoting his friends, his students, etc. Also, it's interesting because sometimes in the commentary, in the Purusha Torah, the second work, he will repudiate, he will retroactively reject what he wrote in Hamishtadel several years earlier. So you'll have like, oh, this is what I believe about this pasuk, and I hereby renounce what I wrote in Hamishtadel several years ago. So these are the main points of Shadal's biblical commentary throughout his life. The challenges of biblical commentary in the 19th century. I'm going to go very quickly over the context in which Shadal was writing, and not just Shadal, but actually several others. And this is actually an important point, which is that the mid-19th century, the mid to late 19th century, saw a tremendous, I would say almost unparalleled renaissance of parshanut on the biblical text, and the production of many commentaries on the Torah, which were entered into the canon of parshanut, the canon of biblical commentary in traditional Judaism, which is interesting because for the previous few centuries, you hadn't had this, right? In the very early, I'd say the early modern periods, so the 15th, 16th centuries, you had figures like Abarbanel, like Ovadia of Sforno, like Ephraim Lunchitz, who wrote the Kli Yakar, and those were canonical commentaries. And then you have about 2 or 3 centuries in which there's very little written in terms of what we call today very important, first-rate classical commentaries. And suddenly in the mid to late 19th century, you had an explosion. So you had Shadal, of course, with his writings. You had Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch in Frankfurt writing his Purusha Torah. You had the Netziv in Volozhin writing Hamek Davar. You had Romeir Leibush Visser, who wrote the Malbim. You had Eliyahu ben Amozeg's Em LaMikra. Towards the end of the century, you start having Rav David Tzvi Hoffman. You have also the oral works, which would become concretized in the Sfat Emet, which is the second Rebbe of Gur. You have this enormous explosion of Parshanut, which all occurs within about a 50, 60-year period. From the mid to the late 19th century. And as I mentioned at the end of last week's session, this is not a coincidence that these Parshanim felt the necessity to write in an era when the biblical text was being so mercilessly, I would say, dissected and desacralized. In other words, portrayed in a way that wasn't consonant with the Jewish tradition. And therefore, within this pressure cooker of hostile ideas, you had this explosion of new and very important, very interesting biblical commentary. So just to mention a few of those challenges, one is, so the early challenges, which really comes from the 18th century more than anything else, and earlier, figures like Hume and Voltaire, etc., they wrote very scathing attacks specifically on the Old Testament, specifically on the Hebrew Bible, because the New Testament, at least there is, or one could see from, let's say, the perspective of a non-religious rationalist, one could see, oh, well, there are many good moral lessons, good moral stories, etc., etc. Whereas the Old Testament are full of these, wild miracles and all sorts of laws that don't seem to have any relevance to the modern period, and therefore you had this strong attack by deists, by atheists on the Hebrew Bible. Then you had the rise of biblical criticism. So already in the early to mid-19th century, you had various German figures such as Eichhorn, de Wette, and others who had started writing works undermining the traditional view of the Hebrew Bible. These works, they questioned several elements of the traditional view of what the Tanakh is. They questioned the historical accuracy. In other words, are the events in the text, did they occur as they said they occurred? Is the work historically accurate? The dating of the books, are the sources that we have even from the time that the book says it's from, right? Perhaps they're from a different time. Perhaps they are written as pseudepigraphically in the sense that, projected into a previous era, and the unity of the biblical books as well. Most famously, the Chumash and the documentary hypothesis, which was, I would say, perfected in a way by Julius Wellhausen in the 1870s, and such works called into question whether the Chumash was indeed one text or whether it was a result of numerous sources redacted over a long period of time. And interestingly, part of this is that some Reformed Jewish scholars, most prominently Abraham Geiger, began to accept these theories, began to recast the Jewish tradition in light of some of these findings of academic biblical critics, and began to reformulate classic Jewish ideas and even really radically re-understand the history of the religious history of ancient Israel based on these. So you have the higher source criticism. Another point you have, which is very important in the mid-19th century, was the lower criticism. And this means lower criticism is detailed attention to the biblical text itself and trying to discover what the original, if there even is one, what the original text really said. Now, what we have today in the Jewish world is known as the Masoretic text. The text is given over to us via the Masorah. And it is the Chumash and the Tanakh that we have that's sitting on all of our shelves. However, there are a few issues with this. Firstly, is the fact that we have slight variations in the manuscripts of the Masoretic text that we have down the ages, but also an issue that many of these early biblical scholars picked up on is that there are many other early textual witnesses to the text. What this means is that there are early translations or versions of the biblical text which are slightly different from the Masoretic text, and who's to say that the Masoretic text has got it right and the others have got it wrong? So, for example, the Septuagint, a very important translation to ancient Greek from the 3rd century, the Vulgate, which is Jerome's translation into Latin, the Samaritan Bible, the early Targumim, for example, the Peshitta, which is a Syriac version of the Bible. All of these tell more or less the same text, except ever so slightly different, except they are, they have variations, and scholars of that century were beginning to say, okay, let's take a look at these versions and try and suggest emendations to the Masoretic text. Maybe the Masoretic text could be improved and could be, be brought back to its pristine originality through an analysis of these original texts. Now, we're going to see Shadal was part, to a certain degree, of this effort, which is extremely interesting, and we'll see exactly how he did it, but that'll come a bit later. And finally, so then the methodological question comes up: how far can such linguistic scholarship use in the Bible? But finally, for Shadal, we have a problem which is almost unique to him, which is that how can one produce a fruitful and interesting and satisfactory commentary on the Bible while at the same time resisting the temptation either to go down the mystical Hasidic path or the philosophical rationalistic path of exegesis? That's actually a very important question because, as I mentioned at the end of last week, so it's actually much easier to provide answers to difficult questions within the Chumash, let's say, if you are committed, if you are open to mystical or philosophical traditions. If you close off both avenues of exegesis, then you have to be much more, I'd say, creative, or many potential answers are closed off to you, and that is a question, a problem I would say almost unique to Shadal. Okay, so a few principles that Shadal has in terms of how he crafted his biblical scholarship. The very first one and most important, obvious one, is the centrality of Peshat. As I mentioned earlier, Shadal was absolutely adamant that the surface level, and I think actually the best way of translating Peshat is the basic meaning, not the simple meaning, that's a different question, but the basic meaning of the verse. For Shadal, that was the most important. That was the understanding that you had to have in order to really understand it, and therefore that was absolutely central to Shadal's endeavors. I'm going to read to you a couple of lines from his Vikuach al Chochmat Kabbalah, in which he bemoans, and he says the following: What is absolutely extraordinary in my eyes is how few seekers of the Pshat there have been among our nation after the sealing of the Talmud. Furthermore, I'm distressed to see that even those scholars who did seek the Pshat did not do so entirely consistently. Indeed, they deviated from it frequently. For instance, Rashi, the great exemplar of Pshat, often deviated from the Pshat to go in the direction of creative and speculative hermeneutics, even if his intentions were noble. And if we turn to the other great commentators, such as Ibn Ezra, Radak, and Don Isaac Abravanel, we find that in many places they deviate from the way of Pshat in other directions, namely towards philosophy. So Shadal is, even though in other places he has tremendous respect for, especially for Rashi, but also for these other interpreters, commentators, and he frequently quotes them and invokes them, sometimes positively, sometimes to argue on them. But nonetheless, he was always concerned, and to his great consternation, all of these canonical Jewish commentators would frequently deviate from the plain meaning of the text in favor of, shall we say, generally philosophical or Kabbalistic ways of reading the text. And he continues as follows: great damage has been caused by the flawed philosophy that spread throughout the world through the Arabs, meaning the Muslim philosophers, who worshipped Aristotle and swore by his name, and the sages of Israel, in order to fit a perfect Torah with the words to philosophy, distorted and misconstrued the words of the Torah, the prophets, the Mishnah, and the Talmud, in order to force it to say that which it never said. They abandoned the Pshat and did not respect it. And then he sort of shifts his focus to criticize similarly the Kabbalists, and he says, the truth is that the Kabbalists took the ideas of the philosophers of their day, changed them slightly in order to align them with our laws and beliefs. Thus, the wisdom of Kabbalah that we've studied in our day is not from our forefathers, not from our earlier sages, but rather from the philosophers, both of whom seek to distance man from his creator. And that's the major line of this whole thing, which is that for Shadal, a surface pshat reading of the biblical text is best precisely because it gives one the most intimate possible relationship between the person and the text, and therefore between the person and God. To have these grand ideational frameworks, either philosophical or Kabbalistic, is to say that actually the Torah isn't really worth what it is worth at its surface. Rather, you have to do much more work within either philosophy or mysticism and then get to the true depth of it. And for Shadal, this was an act of distancing a person from their creator, an act of making sure that someone had to learn much more about a very convoluted system of ideas before being able to say that they have really gained what they need to gain from the Torah. Interestingly, Shadal applies the centrality of Pshat even when it conflicts with rabbinic traditions or rabbinic teachings or halakhic traditions. Now, this is interesting. Shadal, like any good sort of traditional Jew, accepted the rabbinic traditions when they reinterpreted verses and he accepted them, and he accepted that was the law. However, he didn't accept that was the pshat. He didn't accept that was the basic meaning of the verse. What do I mean? I mean, for instance, when we say ayin tachat ayin, right? That an eye for an eye. So famously, the rabbis said this doesn't mean literally, rather it is the monetary value of an eye for an eye. And while without saying that Chazal were wrong, he said, no, this is in fact the law, but that's not necessarily the pshat. The basic meaning of the verse can actually contradict what the rabbi said. And it's important to understand the pshat, even if, even if one does accept the rabbinic reading, and that's very influential and important for later thinkers, such as Mordechai Breuer and other later biblical commentators, but that's taking us too far afield. A second very important set of principles upon which Shadal's biblical commentary is based is the fact that he quotes widely from all sorts of sources, and centralizes philology and grammar. Okay, and as I mentioned last week, philology, grammar, the technicalities of the Hebrew language was something that Shadal wrote an enormous amount about and really saw as a necessary prerequisite for any kind of competent scholarship within the Jewish realm. So I'm actually going to do a little, bring you through a little bit of Shadal's parasha notes. So we have this verse in Exodus 2:3, which says the following: "V'lo yachla od hatzafina v'tikach tevat goma v'tachmara b'chimar v'zafit v'tasim bach et hayeled v'tasim basuf al sfat hayor." And this is referring to the mother of Moshe, who cannot hide the baby anymore, and she makes a tevat of gomer. She makes a little basket of gomer, and she puts on the outside chemar v'zafit. Now, chemar and zafit are words that does come up later in the Bible. We understand what it is. But what does this word gomer actually mean? So I'm going to present you one piece of Shadal, which I think is very, it's a bit of an extreme example, but it is very representative of the kind of openness that his commentary contained, which goes as follows. So I'm going to put the whole thing. I'm going to guide you through it because it is a little bit complicated, especially as I couldn't all format it on one line. It goes, Gomer, who, and I've put an ellipsis here, it should say papyrus. I just couldn't figure out the formatting, but it has in Latin letters, in English letters, who papyrus. It is, Goma is papyrus, Hagodel Itzel Hayor, that grows next to the river. V'nikrakin milshon hagmeinina. Hagmeinina is a reference to the verse in Genesis where Eliezer, or rather the servant of Abraham, the Eved Abraham, asks of Rivka, Hagmeinina mayim mikadech. Give me to drink a little bit of water from your jug. Liot godel etzel hamayim, because that grew next to the water. In other words, this papyrus, these kinds of reeds that grow next to the Nile or next to the water in question. V'ki'ilu hu tzarech lishtia, and you need it in order to drink. So these reeds function also as a kind of straw or a way through which one can drink. Hence the hagbi'inina, give me to drink, meaning feed me through a straw, through one of these reeds, a drink of water. V'chein lukan. And so too, this is what Lucanus, who was an important Roman poet of the first century, karu bibula papyrus, which means soaked papyrus, soaked paper, or papyrus, these reeds. Sorry, and I'm skipping to the next line, which is the English, sorry, the Hebrew. Vahayu osim mimenu begadim, they make from it clothes, mena'alim, shoes, salim, baskets, v'gam sfinot, and also ships. They'd actually make entire ships from this papyrus. V'zeu lashon Lucanus, this is what Lucanus said, conseritur bibula memphitis simba papyro, which I had to look up, I have to be honest, which means that I have it here, that the ships of Memphis were built from soaking papyrus, from bibulo papyrus. The ships of Memphis, according to Lucanus, and then he puts here in the brackets Roz Vegiz, which is actually only for the sort of the initiates, and that is Rosenmuller and Gesenius, who were senior German biblical scholars at the time. And here you have in one little paragraph a few extraordinary qualities of Shadal's biblical scholarship. Firstly, he is quoting from Lucanus, Lucan in English, a Roman poet, and he's emphasizing that Roman poet is speaking about ancient Egypt. So he's quoting an ancient source and showing sensitivity to the fact that this is an ancient Egyptian context, and therefore Gomer must be understood as these kinds of reeds growing next to the Nile. And he's quoting the full verse in Latin, which he obviously must have been familiar with. And he's quoting Rosenmuller and Gesenius, which were senior German scholars at the time. All of this within the space of about 3 or 4 lines, demonstrating the length to which Shadal was willing to go in which to correctly, in his eyes, comment on a verse by drawing together ancient poetry, by bringing together, parts of Latin, but it's sort of a light being shed on ancient Egyptian history, and by quoting his contemporary non-Jewish Bible scholars. And this brings me to a golden rule that I'm sort of made up myself, but an important rule when it comes to Shadal's attitude towards biblical scholarship, which goes as follows. He is very much intent on welcoming, or he's very open to scientific common sense scholarship. When I say scientific, I mean something like philological, grammar, syntax, all of that, all of the, I would say, more scientific elements of language scholarship, that is, for Shadal, legitimate to incorporate, to assimilate into Pshat. However, speculations, philosophical speculations about what may or may not be correct, or may or may not be, what can or can't be true Pshat of the Pasuk, which we'll get to in a minute when he discusses Spinoza and Ibn Ezra. So that those are not. He's very open to scientific scholarship, very much close to the kind of philosophical speculation. And it's also important to note that not a small amount of 19th century German scholarship on the Hebrew Bible was informed by elements of the philosophy that was common, that was trendy within the German academia of the time, specifically certain historicist ideas from Herder, from Hegel, certain theories of the development of religion from Auguste Comte as well. There's certain philosophical, and for Shadal, that was illegitimate. You couldn't bring your own fancy theories about religion, your own fancy theories about how history goes into the Bible, but you could bring in grammar and syntax and ancient philology and things like that. A third principle that I want to bring up is Shadal's literary sensibility. Now, I mentioned last week, Shadal is a poet, wrote 2 volumes of poetry. His Hebrew is very lyrical, and he had this quite superb sensitivity towards or one might say a literary sensibility towards the text and understanding the text and bringing up points that others hadn't raised, precisely because Shadal had that kind of extraordinary ear for these finer details of the text. So, for example, there's the famous verse in Exodus 15:1, which is the beginning of Shirat Hayam, which says, Sus v'rochvo rama bayam, which means the horse and his rider was tossed up into the sea. Okay, what is the problem? The problem, possible issue could be, why is it in the singular? Surely it should be susim v'rochvehem, that horses and their riders were talked about in the sea. Why the horse and his riders? Shadal comes in, and this I put in English, goes as follows. In the poetic parable, singular is better than plural, for the feeling is much stronger because the reader's thoughts fit among many topics. Flit among many topics. Consider, for example, bring justice to the orphan, plead the widow's cause in Isaiah. Were it said to bring justice to the orphans and to plead the cause of the widows, in the plural, the parable would lose a great deal of its power, as the reader's thought would flit among many orphans and widows. Now all of them are gathered into one orphan and one widow. Now you might agree with Shadal, you might not, but the point is that he took a look at this passage and said, okay, why is it in the singular? And he thought that within poetic, within a deeply aesthetic kind of verse in which it isn't so much the precise historical detail as much as the invoking of emotion that's important. He said, so if you portray it as one, plead the justice of the orphan, of the widow, the horse and the rider, he says that focuses the reader's mind on one particular example of that entity and therefore makes it much more vivid, much more imaginable. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. The point is that the exquisite aesthetic sensibility, which very much is visible throughout Shadal's commentary in the many books in which he was a real commentator. Okay, a fourth principle, and perhaps one that is very much of a piece with other parts of his philosophy, is the Torah's focus not as a factual work, not as a history book, and not as some kind of guide to complex theology, as the rationalists thought, but rather instructional, rather to live the long life. And one of the best examples is the very first verse of the Bible, which says, so you have this first chapter in Genesis chapter 1, in which you have a very detailed description of the creation of the world. So the question would naturally come up is, what do we need this for? What is the Bible trying to teach us? Because a medieval or pre-modern commentators would say, oh, the Bible is giving us a literal blow-by-blow account of how God created the world. It is a historical work. It is to teach us scientific facts about how the universe came into being. Shadal rejects this. He doesn't necessarily reject that's how it went, but he rejects that is the main point of the book because he doesn't see it as a primarily historical work, and he has the following comment. The enlightened ones will understand that the intent of the Torah is not to inform about the natural sciences, and the Torah was not given except to straighten the ways of man to righteousness and justice, and to establish in their hearts the belief in his unity and providence, since the Torah was not only given to the sages, but rather to the whole people. This is very important, as I said before, the Torah as an exoteric text, a text that can be read on the surface by ordinary people with great profit and can be assimilated into people's lives. And then he says the following, which I very much admired. And behold, God wanted to inform people of the unity of the universe and the unity of mankind, since error in both of these matters caused great evils in ancient times. From the lack of awareness of the unity of the universe, it came that people would believe in the existence of specific gods with defects and inferior character traits, and they will do evil acts in order to please these gods. And from the lack of awareness of the unity of mankind, it came out that people of one nation would hate and revile the people of another nation, and they would act towards them with the force of arms and not with justice and righteousness. And these two fundamental principles, the unity of the universe and the unity of mankind, are the main point of the stories of the creation saga. I have to say, I love this little piece of Shadal because I think it is extremely relevant and contemporary to Jewish educators today. If someone were to come up to you and say, what is the point of Genesis chapter 1? It's quite difficult today to maintain that the point of the story is to tell us a blow-by-blow historical scientific account of how the universe came into being. Shadal says, no, but that's not what it's trying to do. It's trying to teach us two principles. Principle number one is the unity of the universe, and therefore one God, one organizing principle behind the whole thing. And the second is the unity of humankind, that we're all descended from one person, therefore we're all part of one family, and therefore it makes little sense to hate or revile other people. After all, we are all brothers and sisters. We are all part of one species. And again, this is, I think, an extraordinary answer, a very modern, and very useful answer. The point of Genesis chapter 1 is to teach the unity of the universe and the unity of mankind. And this very much flows from Shadal's fervent belief that the Torah has an instructional, practical, ethical priority. That is the main guiding principle behind all the texts of the Torah, and that is something that can be read profitably across the whole Torah, and most especially in Genesis chapter 1. Okay, now we're going to move on to, how much time do I have? Okay, I have a little bit of time. We're going to look at two of the most, I would say, controversial elements of modern biblical scholarship and how Shadal played out within this particular world. That is textual emendations and dating of texts. Okay, so the first one is the whole notion of textual emendations. As I said before, incidentally, again, this came up very much in the 19th century with a renewed wave of scholarship into all sorts of prior texts, or all sorts of ancient witnesses to the texts, such as the Septuagint and the old Targumim and the Vulgates, etc. And so scholars were creating, or rather rereading the Masoretic biblical text and tweaking the verses, or saying, I don't think this is the correct word, I think this is a little bit different, this should be here, this should be there. And of course, once again, the more you believe that the Torah, or the Tanakh, more accurately, is not a divinely inspired work, the more you believe it's a profoundly human work, the more likely you are to say, okay, so the Masoretic text we have in front of us must have undergone many corruptions, many over the centuries must have become corrupt, must have moved away from its pristine originality, and we're going to try and restore it. So Shadal he was one of the very first traditionalist scholars to somewhat participate in this whole endeavor of textual emendation. So, as I said before, Shadal was very, very well versed in linguistics and grammar, probably the greatest rabbinic example of the 19th century of this. We also mentioned last week the Nekudot and Ta'amim, that is the vowelation marks and the cantillation marks. He saw this as a late invention, which Shadal was happy to play around with. He was happy to read verses against the grain of the Nekudot and the Ta'amim, not part of the original Masorah going back all the way over to Moses Sinai. And Shadal, very interestingly, viewed textual corruption as a possibility, but he believed, and here is where he diverged from Geiger and other reformist scholars, he believed it was never done deliberately. In other words, he said it is possible that in the Tanakh we have nowadays, over the centuries, there were some corruption or some mistakes made through copying manuscripts one to another, generation after generation of scribes, but never deliberately. It was never part of an effort to try and fool people, to try and create some kind of different part of the religion. And therefore, he did suggest certain small corrections to Masoretic text. So I will read a brief paragraph here where he says, the books of the Holy Writ were kept constantly in the midst of Israel as a precious, beloved treasure, and no one ever set a hand against them to falsify them, to add to them, or to take away from them. Despite this, it would have been impossible, after so many transmissions and so much copying, not to have alternate versions, one of which is correct, emerging from the hands of the author, and the other only the mistake of the copyist scribe. This was more common in previous generations when the books were not bound together in individual volumes. However, there are only very few errors or alternative versions. And again, this speaks to Shadal's duality playing out within Shadal. On the one hand, the punctilious scholar who looks at the text and says, it does seem that there were some minor scribal errors, but also the traditionalist who said, no, it was likely there were only very few errors. They came, only in the ancient times and never on purpose, and there are only a few of them in Tanakh at all anyway, and therefore, again, it was a partial recognition of the scholarship, but also a very strong traditionalist loyalty in Shadal. And Shadal did in fact make various emendations to the later books, and very rarely within the Chumash himself, because of course the Chumash it becomes much more dicey and problematic due to the doctrine mainly expounded by the Rambam, by Maimonides, of the textual inerrancy, right? Maimonides said specifically in, I believe it's the 8th of the 13 principles of faith, that not only do we have to believe the Torah is from Moses, we have to believe the Torah that we have now is exactly as it was then. No word, no letter changed, nothing missing, nothing added. Everything's exactly as it was in the time of Moshe when it was given thousands of years ago. And so Shadal was obviously far more comfortable, we'll get to this in the next slide, suggesting emendations to the later books, and very occasionally also in the Chumash itself, but usually without changing any of the letters, really just moving around the vowels. And also he did it, I wouldn't say sparingly, but only when he was forced to by the Pshat. I'm going to give you the most famous example of Shadal's textual emendations. I need everyone here to concentrate for a moment, because I'm going to explain why and how this came to be. And it's an emendation which, as far as we know, Shadal made up himself, and was extremely widely accepted even by non-Jewish scholars after Shadal's death, and is still credited as this kind of innovation of Shadal in the following passage. We're all very familiar with this verse, right from Ezekiel. Vatisaini ruach v'ashma acharai kol ra'ash gadol baruch kavod Adonai mimakomo. Right, this is towards the end of Ezekiel's famous vision of the chariots, and he says that the Spirit lifted me, and I heard behind me a loud noise saying, Baruch, blessed is the Lord from his place. Now, this is obviously very familiar to us because it is entered into the liturgy of our everyday prayers, in Kedusha, in Uva L'Tzion, and various other prayers, and therefore this is something that we have very much adopted this pasuk because we are, so to speak, quoting the angels, quoting the chayot, quoting those sort of heavenly beings around the chariots, saying Baruch Kavod Adonai Mekomo. The problem is that if you look at this verse here, this Hebrew verse, it gets it's a little bit difficult to explain for the following reason. The Spirit lifted me, and I heard behind myself a loud noise, and then it doesn't say who said it, or why they said it, or when they said it, or even that people said it. If you look in the translation, I have provided in the brackets here the word saying and a colon, and then speech marks. But blessed is the word from his place. Blessed is the glory of God from his place. However, in the original Hebrew, you don't have it. It just says a loud noise, Baruch Kavod Hashem Mekomo, right? There is no, it's unusual. You should have words there, something like V'hachayot amru Baruch Kavod Adonai Mekomo, right? That would make it much smoother. Right now, it reads as though there's this giant wedge between Gadol and Baruch, which needs to be sort of filled in by the translator, by the brackets. And this seems to be difficult to understand. So Shadal suggested the following. Again, it's an emendation of the text, but it is an attempt to make the text much smoother and much more comprehensible. He says the following: the great roaring sound, the Kol Ra'ash Gadol, it says the great roaring sound does not sit well as a description of the sound of a speaking voice. Rather, it refers to the sound of the wings of the chayot as they move. So he said the Kol Ra'ash Gadol, a ra'ash, is very rarely speech. Ra'ash just means noise, like white noise. It doesn't mean directed speech generally. Moreover, in the entire story of the chariot, we do not find the speech imputed to chayot at all. So he says those in Ezekiel's entire vision, you don't have any of the angelic figures speaking. It's very interesting that we say in our prayers that we're as though invoking the speech of the angels, but it seems that these angelic creatures don't speak. Therefore, he suggested the verse must be read as follows: Then a spirit carried me away, and behind me I heard a great roaring sound, as the glory of God ascended from its place. And in Hebrew, it is, instead of Baruch Kavod Adonai Mekomo, it is Barum with a mem. Kavod Hashem Imkomo, right? In other words, it is, instead of, and I heard behind me a loud noise, Barum Kavod Hashem Imkomo, when the glory of God rose from its place, then I heard the loud noise. That actually makes a lot of sense. That makes the whole verse very smooth. From beginning to end, it just reads, and the wind lifted me up, and I heard a loud noise when God's glory ascended. That's a very smooth reading the pasuk, and all it needs is the changing of one letter, a kaf, to the final kaf of Baruch to the final mem. Now, what's interesting, and Shadal didn't know this, is that in Paleo Hebrew text, the kaf, the final chaf and the final mem are very similar. In fact, they're almost indistinguishable. And therefore, later scholars who did have access to this Paleo Hebrew text have suggested that this is actually a very plausible rereading of the pasuk, because the whole thing is much smoother, as I said, and it only requires the tiniest change of one letter. And it's very plausible to think that over the hundreds of generations of scribes and copyists, there was a small error crept in, and therefore, we should have this emendation. Now, of course, this emendation is quite daring because it completely rereads, completely reimagines this verse, and therefore sort of whips out the rug from a part of the Jewish liturgical text in which this plays a central role. So, whether this should be adopted into our prayers, I don't think Shadal would have said that, but Shadal's thinking from a scholarly perspective: how can I do the least violence to this verse, while also making sure it makes the most possible sense and is most readily comprehensible to the average person? And this is what he came up with. So this is an example, probably the most famous example, of Shadal's emendation to a text. Again, it's a text in Yechezkel, in the prophets, where he did this quite frequently, but in the text of the Chumash, he very, very rarely resorted to text emendations. The final thing that I want to touch on before finishing is Shadal's dating of various biblical books. Now, Shadal had always the traditionalist approach, in which he said the entirety of the Tanakh is A, divinely inspired, and B, of sound integrity. Shadal had no time whatsoever for or very, very little time, I should say, for the findings of higher criticism. In other words, this notion that various biblical books are made of different sources, different fragments sewn together by a much later editor, much later redactor. Shadal rejected this out of hand. He believed they're all divinely inspired, and also that all these books came more or less as complete units as they were, and therefore have a certain basic soundness, basic integrity. He rejected to a large degree higher criticism. Now, obviously, as we know, the Tanakh is divided into three parts: the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim. And Shadal had a different approach to each one. So when it came to the Torah, when it came to the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash, Shadal was absolutely traditional. Moses wrote this regardless of any scholarship. And I have to say, as sort of intellectual historian, there seems to be very little scholarly basis for this position of Shadal. In other words, Shadal was quite happy, as we're going to see in a moment, to sort of apply at least some of the findings of biblical scholarship to the later books, whereas when it came to the Torah, Shadal defended its absolute perfection and Mosaic authorship really from a religious perspective. It didn't come from his scholarly side, rather from his instinctive religious traditional side, and it was very he was absolutely adamant that this was the case, whereas, from a strictly intellectual perspective, it's not so easy at all to see why the Chumash should be spared the kind of scholarship that is applied to the later text of the Hebrew Bible. So, for example, famously, I'm going to do this extremely briefly, Okay, I have a little bit of background. There are various psukim in the Torah, this is quite famous, quite well known, that it seems at least, to have been written possibly from a later date. So one of the most famous examples is Deuteronomy 1:1, the first verse of the Book of Dvarim, which says that this book was written be'ever hayarden. Now, what's the problem with saying that the book was written by Moshe be'ever hayarden is if you're calling that area the Transjordan, the other side of the Jordan, it implies that you are sitting in Eretz Yisrael, right? It implies that the author of the book is sitting in the correct side of the Yarden, i.e. in Eretz Yisrael, and the book is being written be'ever hayarden, on the other side of the Jordan. And famously, Ibn Ezra writes on this, that these and other psukim are part of the Sod Hashneim Asar, the secret of the 12, Maskil Yavin, and that's it, and it says no more. So this, Ibn Ezra leaves us with this kind of tantalizing hint as to what this might be, but never extrapolates. And Baruch Spinoza famously read this verse and read this commentary of the Ibn Ezra as Ibn Ezra endorsing the idea that certain psukim were added in by later authorities, later authors, right? And this is one of the very foundation stones of biblical scholarship. And Spinoza was a foundational biblical critic, in the sense that thinking that no, the 5 books of Moses weren't written by Moses, and we can tell that some verses were added in later because of the internal evidence of each verse. And essentially, Shadal has a very long piece in the first pasuk of the Sefer Dvarim, completely rejecting this and saying no, and providing a whole other explanation of what Ibn Ezra meant, and basically rejecting this reading of the Ibn Ezra, because Shadal was not only traditionalist when it came to reading the Bible, he was also very traditionalist when it came to the great biblical commentators. He couldn't fathom the idea that Ibn Ezra was part of this sort of shadowy cabal of commentators who believed that there were verses later on tacked into or inserted into the Chumash. He believed that this was nonsense. And in fact, he was very upset at some of his colleagues in the Wissenschaft Unit movement, such as Yost and Geiger, who suggested later datings from the Chumash based on the works of Spinoza and later critics as well. So when it came to Torah, he was absolutely traditional. When it came to the prophets, to the Nevi'im, he was also traditional with the dating, but yet felt quite free to add his own interpolations. As we saw, added in the interpolation vis-a-vis Yecheskel chapter 3, verse 12, as we saw on the previous slide. And he had his great arguments with 2 of the great Eastern maskilim called Nachman Krochmal and Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport, Krochmal and Shir, regarding the second half of the book of Yeshayahu. This is also a fairly famous claim, but the book of Yeshayahu at least appears on the face of it to have 2 halves to it. The first is chapters 1 to 39, that was clearly written by Yeshayahu ben Amoz, an 8th century prophet who's living in Jerusalem before the Churban of the year 586, before the destruction of the first Bet Midrash, and telling his society, listen, you have to shape up and you have to do what God wants you to do, otherwise there will be in the future a great tragedy, a great Churban. The second, the last 26 chapters 40 to 66, beginning with the phrase Nachamu Nachamu Ami, those appear to be written much later. They appear to be written on a retrospective perspective, from the perspective of a prophet who's living in exile a prophet who, after Jerusalem is already destroyed, and he's providing nachamu, he's providing comfort for the Jews who have been exiled. And he mentions Koresh, the Cyrus, the Persian emperor of the time. And basically, there's seemingly quite a bit of evidence that chapters 40 to 66 were written by a later prophet. And this is a question that has been debated among Jewish scholars, quite vociferously from that time, from Shadal's time until this, and including him, Shadal defended the unity of the book of Isaiah. He insisted the whole of Yeshayahu, from chapter 1 through chapter 66, is actually the work of one author, unlike the biblical scholars who claim there are at least two, maybe three or four authors to the book of Isaiah. And the reason he did this, and he provides a very strong sort of ideological reason for defending this, is because why would someone claim that chapters 40 to 66 are of a later prophet? Because it is based on this idea that prophecy cannot accurately predict the future, or that when a prophet speaks, it's impossible for a prophet in the 8th century to speak fully and accurately as though he's in the 6th century, as though he's already seen the Khurban, as though Koresh has already risen to the throne, he's already in Persia, and he knows all the details of this later time. Whereas Shadal says no, Shadal holds fast to this idea that a prophet really is what a prophet claims to be, i.e. he can see into the future. He is given this divine foresight, as it were, and able to speak as though he is in a much later time. And therefore he argued with Krochmal and Rappaport, who themselves are very conservative and very, not among the biblical scholars who are trying to undermine the integrity of most biblical texts. But he was very insistent, Shadal, against them, that no, Isaiah has to be kept as a unity, precisely because we must defend this notion that prophets really were, as the prophets claim to be, i.e. able to say what will happen in the future. Whereas Krochmal and Rappaport said, yes, prophets can do that. However, the weight of the evidence is on the side that there was another prophet who wrote in the book of Yeshaya, who perhaps called Yeshaya, and was able to write in that vein, and his works were added in. So, also, as we saw before, when it came to the prophets, the Nevi'im, Shadal added in more various of his own interpolations. Finally, when it comes to the Ketuvim, he felt very free. I would say really quite free to follow scholarly intuitions, both in terms of dating and in terms of adding in his own emendations and interpolations. So, for example, he believed that some of the Psalms, some of the Tehillim were later dating. There are some very famous examples. Most famous is Psalm 137. Al Naharot Bavel Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu. Seems very difficult to believe that King David 5 centuries earlier was predicting, or was talking in the past tense about sitting in the rivers of Babylon and crying and mourning the Beit Midrash. Right? This does seem to be a psalm of a later deity, and Shadal accepted this. Also, interestingly, there was one biblical book that Shadal really didn't like very much, and it was the Book of Kohelet. And anyone who's been following these classes until now should see why he really despised the Book of Kohelet, because Kohelet, Shadal was all about ethical living, traits such as emet and chemla and rachamim and tzedek, whatever. And all of these were grievously undermined by the author of Kohelet, who basically, in various parts of his book, said things like, nothing really matters. All one needs to do is eat and drink and have fun today, because tomorrow we're all going to die, etc. And that, that's a very strong theme within the Book of Kohelet. And Shadal was very upset about this, and believed that Kohelet could not have possibly be written by Shlomo HaMelech. Rather, it must be later, both on linguistic grounds, and this is something that modern scholarship is very much agreed upon, that Kohelet must have been much later because of the language it used, but also on doctrinal grounds, that it must have been a much later thinker of some kind who propounded these sorts of doctrines, and therefore Shadal felt free to reject the traditional dating of this book, both on linguistic ground and doctrinal grounds. And this is, in summary, in sort of on one foot, Shadal's understanding and his attitude towards the different parts of the Tanakh, and what he felt he was licensed to do in terms of within the framework of the Torah, of the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, and this brings us to the end, I think, of Shadal's of our presentation of Shadal as a biblical scholar. I will now stop the share and open up for questions.
Thank you so much. That was a really interesting, insightful shiur. I'm sure I personally gained a lot from seeing a lot of the kind of earlier academic thoughts writings that appear in Shadal. Some of those arguments are still discussed till today. Mm-hmm. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute.
One question.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, thank you so much. Fascinating. Regarding the suggestion about Baruch Kevod All right, the Baruch, considering he didn't know the evidence or that you mentioned of the original script, what was his methodology to come up with that change? Is it just based on what he thought the Peshat could be? I'm trying to understand. He's sort of quite lucky with that finding that you mentioned, but if not for that, I don't understand where he's coming from.
So he's coming from, as I introduced it, which is that the verse as it stands has two parts to it, and they don't neatly. There's no neat sort of bridging conjunction between them, right? One would expect something like va'amru, v'chayot amru, or something like that. In other words, it could, or perhaps lemor, that word could have done. It seems odd that you have this sort of two completely different parts. Now, what's interesting is that some translators of this verse, I looked this up before, of some English translators to this verse, what they do is they put a full stop after kol rash gadol, end of quotation marks, and Baruch Kavod Hashem Komo is just, part of the next thing, is just this kind of declaration by the prophet. It's no longer what the Chayot said, right? It's just, and that also helps dealing with it. But what Shadal was trying to do, I think, was to have the smoothest possible reading of the Pasuk with the minimal amount of change, because the moment you start switching entire words out, let's say, the moment you start maybe deleting a few words, that already gets to, I would say, quite theologically treacherous positions, right? You say, okay, well, if we can delete half a pasuk from Yechezkel, who knows what else we can start deleting, right? What Shadal, I think, wanted to do was, okay, let's make this pasuk smooth, let's make it make sense, and let's change one tiny letter. And it so happens that later scholarship showed that actually changing that letter is very plausible, because you have the small cuff, the cuff in the mem. So I think that's probably the likeliest answer I can give. And again, I would say that Shadal, and he'd written this in his own letters, that he really only resorted to emendations of verses when he felt he didn't have another choice. If he could find a way of sewing it together, or find a pshat level, a good way of understanding the verse, or even just declaring he didn't know, these were all options to him. Emendations were things he had when he really felt that there was something that ought to have been changed. I would say he was as conservative as one could possibly be, while still being open to making textual emendations, which is actually, again, this is why I find Shadal so fascinating. He's this mixture of the conservative and the open to some kind of modern scholarship, and the sense that modern scholars were onto something. They weren't just talking nonsense. They were onto something, but also hanging on to the basics and hanging on to the ideological foundations which he thought were most important.
Was there anyone else who took that middle path? You mentioned Rabbi Yehuda Levi, but I'm talking about more modern to his time, where there was sort of open, quite critical, but at the same time traditionalist.
Very few. The answer is very few. The only one I can sort of think of, because again, everyone in the Orthodox camp was unwilling to do any kind of emendation, more or less, and those in the Reform camp were willing to take apart entire text. One I could think of who was quite close is actually the historian Heinrich Gretz. Okay, the historian Heinrich Gretz was quite like Shadal in terms of his instinctive small c conservatism, instinctive traditionalism, but open to making emendations. In fact, there's a funny story, very briefly, so Gretz used to teach in the same school as Zacharias Frankel, who was the great rabbinic leader of a form of Judaism that later morphed into conservative Judaism, but a very considerable scholar, wrote this groundbreaking book on the Mishnah. And what happened was, apparently, Gretz would sometimes get called up to say the Haftorah, right? And he'd read the Haftorah, but he would add in those emendations that he thought ought to be added in. And then Frankel would get up after him and repeat the whole Haftorah in front of everyone, because he thought that, he'd read it wrong. So you have this, one teacher getting up and then the Rosh Yeshiva standing up and just doing it all over again. I think it's a fantastic story. Anyone else?
Thank you. If I could just ask a question. I was just wondering about was there any basis beyond the traditionalist view that Shadal was less willing to accept kind of the same scholarly approach to Torah in contrast to, let's say, Ketuvim? Or I guess if the answer is, yeah, he just wasn't happy to because it was traditionalist, what was his view on the difference in level, difference in sacred status between the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim?
So I'd say the following. Shadal in one place, in fact, is an introduction to Yeshayahu, I believe, has quite a lengthy, it's worth a read, because it's quite a lengthy outline of his methodology. Okay, as introduction to Yeshayahu. And I believe it's in there where he does try and prove, he gives reasons why he believes that the Torah is actually what it says it is, actually authored by Moshe Rabbeinu, one unified text, and gives a certain reasons. I don't have them all sort of on the tip of my tongue. I do know that I'll put it this way: much of the criticisms of the Torah, of the Chumash, were those higher scholarship forms of criticism, which Shadal felt were very speculative in nature, right? For instance, the most famous of which, right, is Wellhausen's idea that the P text. Well, those who know what I'm talking about, will enjoy this. Those who don't, feel free to tune out for a moment. But basically, the German critics, especially Wellhausen, had an idea of how religion ought to develop, okay, and took the biblical text and put them in order, dated them in a certain order of how they believed religion ought to develop from a kind of primitive way of viewing God as like this corporeal, almost king-like body, all the way to the much more abstract and ethical monotheistic way of doing religion, right? And basically charting, basically dated what they thought the source of the Chumash was on their theory of how they think a religion ought to develop from the primitive to the rational, okay? And Shadal wasn't willing to play those games. He wasn't willing to say, okay, based on theories we have now of the development of religions, we are going to, Ewald and Hupfeld and especially Wellhausen, a lot of their scriptural work came on the basis of these kind of theories of religion. And in fact, famously, Solomon Schechter, one of the great scholars of the late 19th, early 20th century, he called higher criticism the higher anti-Semitism. It's like a very famous way of what he called it, because he felt that what Wellhausen and others were doing was trying to show a decline and degeneration in the ancient Israelite religion, which then Christianity came and saved, right? The Christian revolution was bringing Israel back to its peak of ethical monotheism and undoing the centuries of decline into formalism and ritualism and temple and whatever. Those were the paradigms, the archetypes they were working with. Whereas, of course, for Shadal, all this wasn't worth taking into account, because for him, these are speculative theories. And like he didn't like the speculations of the Rambam, and like he didn't like the speculations of the Zohar, he doesn't like the theoretical speculations of a German scholarship. He likes their grammar, he likes their philology, he likes their history, doesn't like their speculations.
Thank you so much. Very informative, enjoyable class.
Thank you.
We hope to welcome you back in the future, certainly, for more that you can share with us.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. And everyone, keep an eye out on the WhatsApp groups for future Habura events. Have a good evening, everyone.
All the best.